Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm truly grateful you're here. I hope this story gives you a moment of calm, a little space to breathe, and a chance to step away from the weight of the day. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe and support the channel. That support means more than you know. It helps me keep going, keep writing, and keep bringing you new stories that can help you relax, unwind, and escape for a while. Tonight's story is about memory, power, loss, and the line a person refuses to cross, even when the cost is high. So wherever you are, get comfortable, take a breath, and let's begin. Selvaris Prime turned under a pale band of morning cloud, and above its capital ring the Hall of Concord was already full. Nadia Thorn arrived through the Eastern Diplomatic Corridor 40 minutes before the opening session, wearing the dark blue civilian seal of Earth Mission Authority rather than military black or tribunal gray. That choice had been argued over the night before. The chamber was preparing to decide whether the Rhyssar Combine would be pushed into permanent isolation from normal interstellar life, and many on Selvaris expected Earth to support the motion. Some expected Earth to lead it. Nadia had insisted on civilian blue because she wanted the chamber to remember one thing. Earth had not come there to relive the war. Earth had come to judge what kind of law the Galaxy Council was trying to build out of that war. Her public role was simple enough to explain. She was Earth's special delegate for post-war stabilization and civilian recovery, a woman who had spent years on damaged stations, cracked port worlds, and corridor settlements where fighting had ended on paper but not yet in memory. Her real burden was simpler and heavier. Nadia Thorn had been born on Cinder Reach, and during the Rhyssar War her younger brother Finn died when a colony freight ring lost power after a strike on the outer grid. Enough people in the council knew that fact to make it useful. By the end of the day, almost everyone would. Jonas Pell, her mission aide, moved beside her with the quiet speed of a man who believed in preparation because it was the only honest defense against politics. The witness schedule shifted again, he said as they reached Earth's crescent. Stationed inside the chamber. Directorate speakers have been moved earlier. Councillor Omelser gets the first political statement. Speaker Terev has been cut to 9 minutes. Nadia asked, officially for efficiency. Of course. She looked across the chamber floor. The Hall of Concord was not beautiful in any gentle sense. It was too large for that, too deliberate in its grandeur. The ceiling rose in layered arcs of bronze glass and lattice stone, carrying light down into the chamber with the cold precision of a machine built to worship procedure. Delegation tiers curved around the central floor in a vast descending crescent, each block marked by its own color band, emblem field, and translation array. Above them, the public galleries were already crowded with aides, press observers, legal clerks, and invited diplomatic staff. The whole chamber had the feel of a place that wanted to look open while keeping every real lever hidden 2 corridors away. At the far side, the witness rail stood under a narrow spotlight. Beyond it, elevated and half in shadow, sat the reserve platform of the Civic Stability Directorate. That was where the second layer of danger lived. The public case against the Rhyssar was simple enough for any frightened world to accept. 3 weeks earlier, several Rhyssar population belts across the Helion corridor had erupted in a violent rebellion, with cargo docks seized, security stations breached, relief lanes cut, and transport hubs thrown into panic. The broadcasts were real. They showed Rhyssar civic cells attacking transport routes, pulling emergency systems apart, and flooding crowd corridors with fear. Hundreds were dead. Thousands more had been displaced. Insurance lanes were collapsing, and smaller corridor worlds were terrified. The Council's answer was Emergency Measure 47. Permanent Isolation. Rhyssar ships would lose open transit. Their trade rights would vanish into supervised channels. Their diplomatic standing would be suspended. They would be sealed behind security frameworks so tight that, even if they survived materially, they would cease to exist as a normal political people. Containment, the public wording called it. Slow erasure. Everyone serious knew. Jonas handed Nadia the revised docket. Ambassador Mar wants us to stay narrow on first response. Challenge access. Do not declare position early. That was before the schedule shift. That is still her instruction. Nadia scanned the docket, then folded it once. The schedule shift is the instruction. They want momentum before anyone can ask where it came from. Jonas did not argue. He rarely wasted time pretending not to understand. You think Sayre will aim at us directly? He will aim at grief, Nadia said. Earth just happens to be carrying it. The chamber signal shifted to amber. Opening call in 10 minutes. A movement near the lower aisle drew her eye. Counselor Sayre was approaching with the effortless rhythm of a man who had never once in his career mistaken courtesy for sincerity. Sayre represented the Vade Dominion, one of the major trade powers behind the motion. He dressed like old authority translated into modern fabric, with a high collar, muted silver trim, and no ornament beyond the Dominion line at his throat. He reached Earth Station, inclined his head, and gave Nadia a look that managed to be sympathetic and evaluative at the same time. Delegate Thorn, he said, I hope Selvaris has not been too unkind. Selvaris is rarely personal, Nadia said, a useful quality in a capital. Sayre glanced toward the witness rail, then back to her. Today we'll ask a great deal of many species. Of Earth perhaps more than most. Nadia said nothing. She let him place his weight first. He did. The chamber remembers Cinder Reach, Sayre said. It also remembers what Earth built afterward. There's respect in that. A certain trust that your government understands the difference between pain and indulgence. Jonas shifted a fraction. He knew the move as soon as she did. Sayre was setting the frame. Earth was mature. Earth had suffered. Therefore Earth would endorse hard order without being accused of cruelty. If she resisted, he would not need to say she was ruled by old wounds. He would only need to suggest that she was departing from the strength Earth usually embodied. You mean, Nadia said, that Earth is useful if it approves what the chamber already wants. Sayre's smile was nearly invisible. I mean only that your words carry unusual moral weight today. Moral weight is what politicians call grief when they think it will vote their way. He accepted the hit without blinking. This is not a theatrical matter, Delegate Thorn. Frontier lanes are in danger. Smaller worlds are afraid. The Rhyssar belts are unstable. If the chamber hesitates now, the signal will travel faster than you think. Then perhaps the evidence will survive scrutiny. The evidence has been scrutinized by the Directorate, by those with access to active security conditions. Nadia kept her voice level. Then the chamber should be grateful when someone asks whether active security conditions have become a way to hide weak foundations. The smile faded, not from his mouth, but from his eyes. You're close to a line, and you're standing on one. For a second, they held each other there. Then Sayre inclined his head again. The Vade Dominion hopes Earth will not mistake delay for wisdom, he said. The Earth delegation hopes the chamber will not mistake speed for truth. He left before she could say more, because men like Sayre never lingered after they had placed the blade where they wanted it. Jonas exhaled quietly. That was the warm version. Yes. The cold version? He won't need it if the room moves the way he expects. A chamber marshal approached from the side corridor rather than the public floor. That alone was strange enough to make Nadia straighten. Delegate Thorn, the marshal said. A witness requests 4 minutes before formal opening. Who? Speaker Tarav of the Rhyssar combined. Jonas stared. That is irregular. The marshal gave the slight pause a man who had already answered that objection twice in his own head. Yes. Nadia looked toward the witness alcove. Speaker Tarav stood under partial light, flanked by 2 chamber guards. He was larger than most beings in the hall, built on the dense frame common to mature Rhyssar, with layered throat plates, long jointed arms, and a face too controlled to read easily if you did not know what to look for. During the war, human recruits had often mistaken stillness in Rhyssar speech for emotional emptiness. That had always been wrong. Rhyssar feeling ran deep and hard. It simply did not move in familiar human ways. Everything in Nadia wanted to refuse. The Rhyssar had shelled colony lanes. They had taken civilian power systems as leverage. Finn Thorn had not died because of an abstract policy paper. He had died because somebody had aimed force at a place full of working people and called it strategic necessity. Yet nothing about the morning fit cleanly. The schedule shift. Sayre's confidence. The reduced witness time. The private approach. How long until opening? Nadia asked. For minutes. She turned to Jonas. Take the seat. If they start without me, object on record. That will irritate half the room. Good. The marshal led her through a narrow side passage lined with acoustic dampers. Chamber noise fell away, and at the end a translucent divider sealed them into a temporary witness booth little larger than a freight lift. Tarav did not begin with apology. More than anything else, that kept Nadia listening. Delegate Thorn, he said through the translator. You asked for me. Yes. You have very little time. Then I will not waste it asking you for mercy. His voice, beneath the translator, carried layered resonance, a sound human ears often learned only after fear. Nadia heard exhaustion in it, not weakness. Compression. What do you want? She asked. For Earth not to let them close this case today. You assume Earth has any reason to protect you. No, Tarav said. I assume Earth has reason to protect itself from the precedent this chamber is about to legalize. The sentence landed hard enough that Nadia did not answer at once. Tarav opened his hand. A thin data wafer rested in his palm. This contains a protected fragment from our civic diagnostic archives. Do not scan it through chamber systems. It will be flagged and erased. Nadia did not take it yet. What am I supposed to see? That our neural lattice was not merely observed. It was altered. The claim was so large that it almost sounded insulting. It had the shape of a desperate species inventing a hidden enemy on sentencing day. Tarav seemed to understand that, because he did not rush to decorate the claim. Our violence is real, he said. The dead in Helion are real. The harm done to Earth is real. I will not tell you otherwise. I am telling you the chamber is being shown the wound as if the wound appeared naturally. Nadia held herself still. You expect me to believe the council engineered your behavior. I expect you to ask why those demanding the fastest sentence are also the ones controlling the oldest records. The marshal outside the divider shifted. Time was nearly gone. Nadia stepped half a pace closer. The Rhyssar attacked Earth colonies. Yes. You killed civilians. Yes. My brother died during your war. Tarav lowered his head a fraction. I know the record. I did not know his name. Fiend. The word came out before. She chose it. She hated that. She hated how grief could still make its own decisions in rooms built for power. Tarav absorbed it in silence. Thorn should not have died in our war, he said at last. Our war. Yes. Not ours alone. He held the wafer out again. If Earth stays silent today, they will make lawful what was first done in shadow. Nadia took the wafer. When she returned to Earth's crescent, the opening call had already begun. The Hall of Concord came fully alive under session light, and public screens rose above the witness rail to flood the chamber with hard images. Bilk Fayus, breached corridors, medical teams dragging injured commuters through smoke. A Rhyssar civic barricade collapsing into violence as armored responders pushed through. Everything on screen was real enough to pull breath from the room. The council knew exactly how to use truth when it wanted to lie with structure instead of with facts. Presiding speaker, Helion, read the motion in formal language. The chamber, he said, was faced with a severe multi-regional governance collapse within the Rhyssar combined, one now presenting sustained cross-sector threat to civilian lives, trade continuity, and interstellar order. Emergency Measure 47 would establish permanent isolation protocols subject to review architecture appropriate to species-level instability. Review architecture. Nadia almost admired the cruelty of the phrase. It sounded measured, civilized, and revisable. In practice, it meant the sentence would harden before any later review could matter. Helion opened the floor to preliminary statements. Ser claimed it at once. He spoke like a man wrapping iron in silk. He did not call the Rhyssar monsters. He called them tragic, unstable, dangerously compromised, recipients of repeated lenience who had now exhausted the galaxy's moral patience. He invoked small worlds along the corridor, freight workers, hospital staff, and children moved into emergency berths because transport grids could no longer be trusted. Then he reached for Earth without naming her. Some among us, Ser said, know from direct experience what restraint after pain looks like. They rebuilt without surrendering to spectacle. They remember the dead without demanding the galaxy remain hostage to memory. Let us honor that maturity now by protecting the living. That line did exactly what it was built to do. It cast support for isolation as disciplined grief. It made dissent look like emotional weakness. It borrowed Earth's losses before. Earth had even spoken. When he yielded the floor, Nadia signaled immediately. Earth requests access, she said, her voice amplified cleanly into the chamber, to the full evidentiary archive underlying this motion, including neurobehavioral diagnostics, pre-incident audit records, dissenting technical reviews, and historical continuity files excluded from the public packet. The hall stirred. Some had expected a speech. She gave them a demand instead. Before Hellion could answer, a new voice cut in from the upper tier. Certain requested materials remained sealed under active security authority. Director Kaelis Warren stood from the directorate platform and stepped into visible light for the first time. He was taller than Sayre, spare and severe, wearing a dark directorate coat with almost no insignia except the line code seal at the shoulder. Nothing about him suggested ornament, and that absence made him stand out more sharply than any ceremonial uniform could have. Nadia had seen his name in policy chains for years. She had not met him in person. He had the look of a man who trusted institutions because he had long ago merged his conscience into one. Warren continued. The chamber has already been briefed through expert review. Emergency conditions do not permit full archive exposure on demand. Then perhaps emergency conditions should not be used to rush a species sentence, Nadia said. The sentence is not rushed. It follows extensive internal review. Internal to the same office asking for the sentence. Warren's expression did not shift. Earth has received all material relevant to its position. Earth will decide that for itself. Hellion intervened before the exchange sharpened further. Delegate Thorn, sealed review can be petitioned through committee procedure. Then Earth petitions sealed review before vote scheduling proceeds. The stir this time was louder. Delay. Inspection. A break in momentum. Nadia could almost hear half the room recalculating. Sayre rose again. The Veda-Minion opposes delay. Civilian losses continue while the chamber entertains speculative procedural objections. Nadia looked straight at him. A measure this large should be able to survive one more look. Tarov was called next. He did not beg. That mattered. If he had, the chamber would have relaxed into contempt and moved on. The violence within the Combine is real, he said. The deaths are real. We answer for the deaths under our jurisdiction. We do not accept the claim that the cause shown to this chamber is complete. Warren requested clarification at once, and from there the hearing became a display of carefully managed disbelief. Tarov stated that Rhyssar civic neural integrity had been compromised over time by methods known to external authorities. Warren answered that no verified record supported species-wide coercive interference and that destabilized populations often generated technical myths to externalize responsibility. Hellion demanded substantiation. Tarov said the records existed inside sealed security custody. Warren called the statement politically convenient. 9 minutes ended. Tarov was removed. The rest of the opening session moved forward with lethal efficiency. Logistics officials described shipping losses. Emergency physicians testified to saturated trauma wards. Small corridor delegates spoke in anger, fear, and exhaustion. Nadia listened closely because those witnesses were not props. Their losses were real, and that was what made the case dangerous. The chamber did not need to invent dead civilians. It only needed to hide how the path toward those deaths might have been shaped. When recess was finally called, Nadia and Jonas left the chamber at once. They moved out of the Hall of Concord and headed straight for the Earth Annex, because whatever Tarov had given her could not be opened inside Council systems. The Earth Annex was 3 corridors away and shielded against chamber systems. They locked the room, powered up a standalone processor, and fed in Terra's wafer. The files opened in segmented packets with old encryption shells and metadata scars that suggested multiple transfers across systems not meant to meet. Nadia began reading. At first, the archive looked like bureaucratic archaeology. Early diagnostic reports, cross-species integration studies, transit behavior audits. But once she aligned the tags by year rather than public classification, a different shape emerged. The Rhyssar civic system included a distributed neural resonance lattice. It was not telepathy and not a collective mind. It was a built-in social system that helped Rhyssar groups steady themselves under pressure, recognize one another, and rebuild trust after fear. That made it useful in crisis. It also made it vulnerable if someone learned how to push against it from the outside. One report, years old, framed the lattice as a challenge to mixed corridor administration. Another proposed passive modulation through approved diagnostic infrastructure to reduce surge behavior during crowd pressure events. A later note warned that continued external biasing might damage memory trust and shared recognition across bonded clusters. Then came the line that made Nadia stop. Breathing for a beat. Adverse cascade effects remain politically manageable if public attribution stays endogenous. Jonas read it over her shoulder and swore softly. Nadia kept going. Trial summaries. Updated corridor risk models. Disagreement memos. Security routing branches. Each layer made the same horror clearer. People in authority had discovered they could apply small, steady pressure to Rhyssar civic systems through legal monitoring tools that looked harmless on paper. Not direct control. Nothing so clean. Just enough to slow recovery after fear. Enough to weaken trust between groups. Enough to make public judgment more brittle over time. Enough to turn a species' social resilience into something easier to break than easier to blame. Then she found a dissent memorandum. It had been written by 3 specialists, one a neuroethicist, one a logistics anthropologist, and one a systems clinician. Their objection was not soft. They stated plainly that continued civic modulation risked producing long-range social fracture likely to be misread as endogenous extremism. Nadia copied one sentence by hand because the processor clock was already warning of session timeout. If intervention continues, future authorities may cite the wound as proof that the patient was never fit for freedom. Silence filled the annex for a long moment. Jonas said, "If this is authentic, it changes everything. It changes why everything looks the way it does," Nadia said. "That is not the same as changing the room." They dug through routing chains. Most names were masked. One was not fully buried. Approval continuation, security transition branch, subdirector C. Warn. There. Not enough by itself to break a government. More than enough to tell Nadia why Warren had entered the chamber debate early. A chime at the side door announced authenticated visitor clearance. Archivist Nemi Quill entered carrying 2 sealed data strips and the expression of someone who had already decided that several professional rules were less important than what was happening. Nemi was lean, pale, and unervingly calm even by archive standards. Her work placed her close enough to old records to understand how often institutions survive by forcing time into neat lines. She looked at the open processor, then at Nadia. "You found the resonance branch. You knew it existed. I knew fragments of it existed. I did not know Speaker Tariff could still access an intact copy." Nadia turned the dissent memo toward her. "How bad is it?" Nemi read fast, her jaw tightening by degrees. "Worse than the chamber packet suggests. Better than what the directorate fears you might piece together." "Translate that," Jonas said. Nemi set the strip down. "The public story says the Rhyssar became progressively more unstable, then turned violent on a scale that makes shared governance impossible. These files suggest that external actors spent years applying subtle pressure to the very civic system the Rhyssar rely on to stay socially stable under stress. Can that produce what we have seen?" "Yes," Nemi said. "Not with certainty, but absolutely with plausibility. If you weaken a species' ability to rebuild trust after pressure, then push that species through scarcity, trade shocks, and political hostility, violent fragmentation becomes much more likely." Nadia looked at her. "Why is this not already in chamber review?" Nemi's answer was so simple it landed harder than any speech. Because then the council would have to ask what kind of law it has been using when no one was looking. Nadia stood very still. This was no longer only about the Rhyssar. It was about a chamber sentence built on ground someone had already salted. "We need authentication beyond archive fragments," she said. Nemi nodded once. "You need a living witness. Someone inside the program chain who can explain the damage in language the chamber cannot dismiss as panic. Do you have one?" "Maybe." That maybe took them 6 jumps to Vestanol. They left Selvaris because the files alone would not stop the chamber, and because by then Nadia knew the record needed a living voice attached to it. Officially, Vestanol was a decommissioning relay. In practice, it functioned as a shelf for things the wider system preferred not to examine too closely. Broken or hulls. Off-register cargo arbitration. Retired service technicians too expensive to disappear and too inconvenient to restore. Its corridors smelled of recycled metal and stale coolant. Even the station gravity felt tired. Dr. Ilya Sorin lived above a machine yard in a private ward built from patched medical units and borrowed airlines. He had once worked inside the Council's neuroadaptive review structure. Now, he rented oxygen support by the week. He looked at Nadia's Earth credentials, then laughed once, which turned into a cough. "So they finally sent the grieving species," he said. "Is that how the Directorate talks about us?" Nadia asked. "That is how governments talk when they need a conscience with combat credibility." Jonas bristled. Nadia ignored it. "We found the resonance files," she said. "We need to know whether the program moved beyond research." Soren studied her face. "You're from Cinderreach." "Yes." He nodded slowly, not as apology, more as acknowledgement of stakes. "Then I will not insult you with simplifications." The program was real. It began as observational adaptation work. He moved to a console with visible effort and brought up an old schematic. Mixed corridor authorities wanted ways to predict mass reaction in Rhyssar civic populations during cross-species integration. Prediction became guidance. Guidance became intervention. Once they discovered that small, sustained signal biases could alter stress weighting inside bonded civic clusters, security offices asked whether selective modulation might reduce future conflict. Did it? Nadia asked. Temporarily, in narrow metrics. That was the trap. The schematic showed overlapping field responses across social clusters, with markers for trust reinforcement, collective restraint, and recovery loops under pressure. "This is not telepathy," Soren said. "People hear neural lattice and imagine something mystical. It is not." He looked directly at Nadia to make sure she followed the essential point. Think of it as a biological social system. When pressure hits, Rhyssar groups do not recover like isolated individuals. Their public order depends on how evenly trust and recognition move through the group. If outside systems begin biasing fear or threat weighting through approved diagnostics, you do not make them obedient. You damage their ability to trust each other again after stress. Nadia followed. That was the important part. Not control. Damage. And once trust recovery degrades, she asked, leadership starts to lose legitimacy. Grievances harden faster. Crowd behavior gets more brittle. Civic correction fails more often. Under scarcity, that can look like extremism. Under repeated pressure, it can become extremism. Did internal warnings say that? Soren gave her a bleak look. In language sharper than anything you found. He opened a storage slab and slid across to her. It contained simulation logs, internal objections, and one restricted meeting extract. In that extract, a security planner argued that even if modulation caused long-term civic fracture, the resulting need for stronger external supervision could be politically useful. Jonas read the line twice. They said that openly? In restricted session, Soren replied. That is where open thinking goes when reputations are involved. Nadia felt something cold settle. Inside her. Why continue after the first adverse effects? Because once an institution has told itself a method is necessary, evidence against the method becomes evidence of why it cannot stop. Soren's mouth twisted. And because damaged populations are easier to classify than to heal. He walked them through the later phase. Corridor security tensions. Trade instability. More aggressive, passively tuned diagnostics applied in Rhyssar zones. Repeated warnings that civic fragmentation was increasing. Reports ignored or rerouted. Then war. The Rhyssar still made choices, he said. Do not erase that. Some of their commanders embraced violence eagerly. Some factions used damage as license. Some atrocities were deliberate in every plain sense. But if you want the honest structure, here it is. Institutions helped injure the social systems by which restraint was maintained, then later treated the resulting fracture as proof the species could not govern itself. Nadia asked the question she had been walking toward since Selvaris. Did those same institutions know that the fracture might later be used to justify permanent control? Soren held her gaze. Yes. The ward seemed to contract around the word. Will you testify? She asked. He looked older then. Not physically. Morally. If I appear, he said, they will destroy what remains of my professional life. What remains now? Enough obscurity to stay breathing. Nadia stepped closer, not soft, but not cruel. They will use your silence as confirmation. They will say the record is incomplete. They will say dissent never rose above technical dispute. They will say the chamber must act because nothing stronger exists. Soren looked at the air tubes in his room, the patched walls, and the machine yard light leaking under the door. I know. If you speak, they may still win, Nadia said. They may call you unstable, compromised, political. They may say you're trying to clean your conscience by setting the chamber on fire. I know that too. But if you do not speak, the sentence hardens on their terms. Silence. Then Soren said, very quietly, my wife used to say institutions never fear the dead properly. They fear records with witnesses attached. Nadia waited. At last he nodded once. I will testify on one condition. What? You do not turn this into a story where the Rhyssar become innocent because the council became guilty. They are not innocent. If you erase their agency, the whole thing becomes sentimental and false. Nadia answered without hesitation. Agreed. Back on Selvaris Prime, they went straight from transit to the Earth mission chambers. The return was abrupt because time was worse than short now. They had only enough of it to turn evidence into something the chamber could hear before fear swallowed the room again. Ambassador Celine Mar read the file chain in the private mission chamber and removed her gloves halfway through. Nadia had learned that Mitmar was no longer thinking only about diplomatic management. She was deciding what cost she could live with. Let us say we proceed, Mar said when she finished. What exactly are we telling the chamber? That the Rhyssar are dangerous, Nadia said. That the dead are real. That the recent violence is real. And that the council does not have the right to turn a wound it helped create into proof a species deserves permanent political erasure. Mar's eyes stayed on her. You realize how badly they will play on some Earth feeds. Yes. You realize smaller corridor worlds may say Earth is sacrificing their safety for moral theater. Yes. You realize the Directorate will not defend itself clumsily. No, Nadia said. It will defend itself beautifully. That is why we have to be clearer than beautiful. Mar was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Very well. We move only if we move all the way. No hints. No floating acquiescence. No half-moralism. We either produce a record strong enough to rupture the proceeding, or we lose and Earth becomes the species that protected its enemy without proof. Nadia accepted that because it was true. The Directorate struck first anyway. Hours before the resumed session, a sealed emergency addendum hit the chamber feeds. New intercepts, new command maps, new excerpts from Rhyssar militant channels calling for infrastructure seizure across the Helion corridor. The release was timed perfectly. Too late for full verification, early enough to flood public opinion. Commentators seized on it instantly. See, they said, this is what hesitation buys. This is what happens when trauma is exploited into moral fog. The Rhyssar planned violence. The council was right. Earth was drifting. Nadia studied the intercepts instead of the commentary. Some lines were straightforward militant coordination. Others contained phrases that did not fit clean command language. Civic rupture, signal bleed, cluster severance, identity fracture. not excuses. Symptoms. That evening, Kalis Warren requested a private meeting with Earth Mission Authority. He arrived alone, which was its own message. Warren did not sit until Mar gestured. Nadia remained standing beside the window field, looking out over Selvar's traffic bans because she did not want the negotiation to begin with the illusion of civility. The chamber is approaching instability, Warren said. I prefer not to let instability multiply needlessly. Mar folded her hands. Then perhaps your office should have brought a cleaner case. Warren ignored the hit. Earth is in possession of legacy materials susceptible to grave misreading. Emotional conditions around this motion are already extreme. Escalating incomplete technical archives into a public morality play will damage civilian confidence across multiple sectors. Translation, Nadia said. You are afraid the chamber will hear what happened in plain language. He turned toward her, his gaze exact and cool. What happened was a series of emergency adaptations made under difficult conditions by actors attempting to prevent larger conflict. Nadia almost laughed at the word adaptations. You interfered with a species' civic neural integrity. We implemented stabilization measures. You damaged them. We mitigated corridor risk and helped build the kind of collapse you now cite as justification for permanent isolation. He let the accusation sit without visible anger. That made it worse. At a certain scale, Warren said, perfect causality is impossible. Systems act under uncertainty. Interesting, Nadia said, because the sentence you want sounds very certain. Warren shifted to Mar. The Directorate is prepared to support an amendment. Strike permanent language. Replace it with supervised civil quarantine and multilateral review. The Rhyssar remain contained. The chamber regains procedural credibility. Earth can present the revision as a victory for lawful process. And in return, Mar asked, no public framing of past security methods as intentional species harm. Legacy questions move to confidential inquiry. Nadia looked at him. What about the truth? Warren's voice did not change. Truth at interstellar scale is rarely singular. No, Nadia said. Cowardice is... Something passed behind his eyes then. Not temper. Recognition that she would not help him clean the sentence into a softer instrument. He rose. You should consider that Earth is not absent from adaptive governance literature. Fast-growing species, rapid integration capacity, uneven compliance culture, resilient frontier violence. These things create policy interest. Do not encourage a chamber mood that reopens dormant thinking. There it was. The threat. Nadia took one step toward him. You just explained exactly why Earth cannot stay quiet. Warren regarded her as if she were a structural defect he had misjudged. I'm explaining that large systems defend themselves. Then tomorrow, Nadia said they can do it in public. He left without another word. Nadia did not sleep much that night. She spent hours rebuilding the argument until it could survive being heard once by people who were already afraid. That mattered more than elegance. The chamber would be full of species with different histories, different biology, and different political reflexes. Some hated the Rhyssar. Some feared the Directorate. Some feared chaos more than injustice. Most would remember only what could be followed cleanly under pressure. So Nadia cut away everything that did not carry one of four loads. Who acted? What was done? What the damage was? Why the chamber could not make it lawful now? At dawn, before the resumed session, she walked alone through the memorial wing behind the Hall of Concord. She needed the silence before going back into the chamber, and she needed to face the one name everyone else kept trying to use on her behalf. The chamber maintained polished galleries for major conflicts, a diplomatic habit designed to imply that systems which preserve memory must therefore respect it. Nadia had avoided the cinder reach display on earlier visits. This time she stopped before the long glass wall carrying the names of the dead. Finn Thorn was halfway down the second column. 19. Maintenance apprentice. Volunteer shift during emergency grid failure. There was no peace in seeing it. Only the old pressure behind her ribs and the newer knowledge that someone, somewhere, had once looked at species like the Rhyssar as variables in a stability equation and later looked at places like Cinder Reach as the natural result of native aggression. Both things could be true at once. The Rhyssar had chosen violence. The chamber had also helped build conditions under which that violence became more likely and more politically useful. Nadia placed her fingers lightly against Finn's name. "I'm not doing this for them," she said to the glass. She was not. Not exactly. She was doing it because if the council could wound a people and later call the wound their nature, then humanity would one day stand in the same light and hear the same language with different names attached. The resumed session began under heavier security and higher public attendance. News of Earth's challenge had spread far beyond Selvaris. So had the new intercept release. The chamber felt sharper now, less ceremonial, more like a machine running hot. Hellion called order. He announced that, in light of Earth's evidentiary petition and pending witness submission, the chamber would hear limited continuance before final vote scheduling. Limited, Nadia thought. The word systems used when frightened. Soren entered under escort. A murmur moved through the tiers. Enough delegates recognized him to understand that the matter had become more dangerous than rumor. Enough others did not to make his ruined physical state part of the testimony before he even spoke. He looked like what institutions did to inconvenient experts when they preferred not to create martyrs. Nadia gave the floor to the witness and let him build the foundation. Soren did not romanticize the Rhyssar. He did not apologize for his own role. He explained the civic neural lattice in plain language. Not mysticism, not species magic. A social biological system through which collective stress response, mutual recognition, and civic recovery operated at scale. He explained that small external biasing introduced through legitimate diagnostic infrastructure could, over time, damage that system unevenly. He explained that warnings had been filed. He explained that those warnings were ignored. When Hellion asked the most important chamber question, Soren answered without hesitation. Did continued external intervention contribute materially, Hellion said, to the conditions later observed as Rhyssar instability? Yes, Soren said. In my professional judgment, almost certainly. The chamber reacted, not with sympathy, with structural alarm. Sarah was up quickly. He tried to box Soren into absolutes. Were the Rhyssar unstable before intervention? Yes. Did they possess militant factions independent of external influence? Yes. Could intervention alone explain the recent uprising? No. Then, Sarah argued, the chamber still faced a dangerous species requiring urgent containment. It was a strong move because it was partly true. Soren refused the simplification. Danger is not the dispute, he said. The dispute is whether authorities knowingly damage the systems by which a species governs itself and now seek to transform that damage into a legal basis for permanent exclusion. Warren requested direct cross-examination. He stepped down from the directorate tier to the central floor, and the visual alone tightened the hall. Security directors did not descend unless the perimeter had already failed somewhere. Warren did not challenge Soren on sentiment. He challenged him on standards. Dr. Soren, he said, you are aware that Rhyssar aggression indicators exceeded corridor tolerance long before any modulation branch received emergency authorization. Yes. You are aware that Rhyssar command rigidity and intercluster violence were documented features of combined political culture independent of security adaptation. Yes. You are also aware that no model inside your field can produce single-cause certainty for large-scale social collapse. Yes. Warren let that settle. He wanted the room to hear uncertainty as acquittal. Then your testimony does not establish that directorate activity caused the current crisis, he said. At most it proposes one variable among many. Soren gripped the rail and answered in a voice rough with age and clarity. At most, it establishes that your office continued an intervention after internal warning stated that the resulting fracture would later be misread as native pathology. A harder murmur crossed the hall. Warren shifted. Emergency security decisions are made under incomplete information. All policy is, Soren said. That does not excuse using the injured result as proof the injury was deserved. Warren produced the overnight intercept package. Are these authentic militant communications? Some appear to be. Then the Rhyssar still organized violence. Yes. Then the chamber still faces the question before it. How should it respond to a dangerous species in active collapse? Soren did not soften. Not by pretending it discovered that collapse in a vacuum. That line broke something in the room. Not enough to win. Enough to change where people were looking. Smaller blocks that had arrived, fearing the Rhyssar, now began glancing up at the directorate tier as if seeing it properly for the first time. Corridor delegations remained furious. Why should their dead matter less? Because some security office had behaved monstrously years earlier. Nadia understood the anger because it was close to her own. This was the hardest part. She could not ask anyone to stop fearing the Rhyssar. She could only force the chamber to confront what kind of law it was about to build out of that fear. During the recess between witness rounds, Sarah approached the corridor outside Earth Station. He did not bother with warmth this time. You are taking the chamber toward paralysis, he said. I'm taking it toward honesty. He looked genuinely tired now, which made him more dangerous. Honesty is not what frightened systems reward, Delegate Thorn. They reward someone who can stop the bleeding. By amputating the wrong limb? By saving the body? Nadia folded her arms. You mean by giving the chamber a sentence it can explain quickly? Sarah's voice lowered. Do not make the mistake of thinking only Warren is protecting himself. There are worlds in Helion that cannot survive another month of uncertainty. There are food corridors already rerouted. There are transit unions threatening independent closure. You're not standing against one villain. You're standing in front of panic. Then perhaps panic should not be handed a false clean answer. And perhaps grief should not be handed a theory and told it as courage. That hit harder than she wanted it to, because it was aimed well. Sarah saw the flicker and pressed. You know what your opponents are saying on the public feeds. That Earth cannot bear to choose because Earth still hears its own dead. That you would rather humanize an old enemy than protect worlds that have no luxury left. Nadia answered quietly. My brother died because people in power kept calling civilian risk necessary. Do not lecture me about luxury. For the first time, Sarah's expression shifted towards something almost human. Then you should understand why frightened worlds want certainty, even from ugly hands. And you, Nadia said, should understand why ugly hands do not get to write permanent law. He left without answering. The chamber reconvened for final motion. Helion, visibly tighter now, announced that Earth Mission Authority had submitted direct documentary evidence linking historical neural intervention reviews to current directorate conflict of interest. Authentication had been provisionally confirmed through archive match chains. The hall reacted not with one sound, but with many layered at once. Shock, anger, excitement, fear. People had begun choosing sides and did not yet know what those sides would cost. Nadia walked to the central arc when Helion called Earth for the closing statement. She set 3 items on the record stand. The dissent memorandum, the approval routing branch, the adaptive governance excerpt regarding humanity. She let the hall see them before she spoke. My name is Nadia Thorn, she said. I speak today for Earth. No ornament, no diplomatic greeting. She let the room come to her. I was born on Cinderreach, during the war with the Rhyssar. My brother Finn Thorn died when a colony freight ring failed after a strike on the power grid. So let the record begin there. Earth does not stand here because we have forgotten what the Rhyssar have done. Earth has not forgotten the docks, the corridors, the dead, or the world still carrying those scars. We stand here because the Council is being asked to make permanent law out of a case whose ground has been shown to be contaminated. She lifted the dissent memorandum. This warning entered internal review years before the current crisis. It states plainly that continued intervention could create future instability likely to be misread as a natural property of Rhyssar civic life. She set it down and lifted the routing branch. This approval chain places continuation authority inside the same security structure, now urging the chamber to define that instability as proof that the Rhyssar no longer qualify for shared political life. Now the final page. And this is why Earth refuses to pretend the question ends with the Rhyssar. Adaptive governance models existed for humanity as well. Preliminary, yes. Not implemented, yes. But the logic was real. Difficult species. Rapid adaptation. Uneven compliance. If you legalize that logic today by voting to remove a people from shared law after institutions helped damage the very systems by which that people governs itself, then no species in this chamber should imagine it is voting only on the Rhyssar. The sound rising through the Hall of Concord was no longer orderly disagreement. It was recognition colliding with fear. Nadia continued before Hellion could try to narrow the moment. Let Earth be clear. We are not asking this chamber to call the Rhyssar innocent. Innocence is not the standard before you. Law is. She turned slightly, enough that Tarav at the witness rail entered the edge of the shared visual field without taking the center. That mattered. The speech could not become reconciliation theater. It had to stay on principle. A people can commit violence and still be denied a sentence built on corrupted ground, Nadia said. If the council, through hidden intervention, degrades a species' civic integrity and later points to the resulting fracture as proof that the species can no longer live under ordinary law, then what you have built is not protection. It is a machine that can injure, classify, and erase any inconvenient population when honesty becomes too expensive. The hall went silent enough for her to hear the translation delay on the upper tiers. Today you tell yourselves the target is the Rhyssar. Another day it will be a labor bloc, a border culture, a fast-growing people, a species too difficult to fold neatly into somebody else's order. One day it may be a human colony cluster judged volatile under the right pressure and the wrong politics. Once the method survives this vote, your only real question is whose turn arrives with the worst public relations. Warren rose without recognition. Presiding speaker, he said sharply, Earth is inflaming speculative fear with unresolved legacy material, while civilians continue dying under active threat conditions. Nadia turned to face him fully. Then answer one question on record. Hellion should have shut her down. He did not. He could not. The chamber would have torn itself apart if he had. Nadia spoke slowly enough that no translation system could blur it. Did your office continue or authorize continuation of Rhyssar civic modulation after internal warnings stated that such intervention could produce the instability later cited as evidence of Rhyssar unfitness for self-governance? There was nowhere for him to hide inside the wording. Warren stared at her. Then he gave the answer systems gave when truth would break them, and lying too cleanly would break them faster. My office acted under emergency mandates approved by multiple oversight authorities in response to severe corridor security risk. Nadia did not blink. Did your office continue the intervention after the warning? Warren held the silence one fraction too long. That was enough. The chamber detonated into motion. Delegates rose. Clerk arrays lit in cascading override colors. Smaller blocks demanded procedural hold. Corridor worlds shouted for security priority. Anti-directorate voices called for archive seizure. Pro-isolation blocks demanded immediate vote before the hall dissolved into chaos. Press drones pushed against lane restrictions. Hellion slammed the order field until the lights dimmed toward enforcement white. In the middle of the noise, Ambassador Marr stood and submitted an emergency substitute motion on behalf of Earth and co-signing blocks. Suspend Measure 47. Remove the Directorate from direct case handling. Place the Rhyssar under temporary restricted transit rather than permanent isolation. Authorize a fully independent civil review with archive seizure authority and public conflict of interest findings. It was not mercy. It was a barricade against precedent. Ser fought hard. He argued that frightened sectors could not wait for inquiry. He argued that Earth was asking living worlds to absorb more risk because old records had suddenly become morally fashionable. Several corridor delegates backed him. Their fear was real. and Nadia hated that her position demanded they bear more uncertainty. That was what made the moment worth something. There was no clean heroism in it. Only competing harms and a line she refused to let the chamber cross. The substitute motion went to emergency procedural vote. The result came back in staggered bands across the chamber lights. Measure 47, permanent isolation, suspended pending investigation. Temporary restricted transit under multilateral civil review. Directorate Conflict Interest Authority removed from the current case. Independent archive seizure approved. A stunned pause followed the result, as if the Hall of Concord itself needed a second to understand what had happened. The Rhyssar were not freed. The corridor worlds were not soothed. The council had not become honorable in one afternoon, but the chamber had been forced to stop the machine before it closed. Terav lowered his head at the witness rail. Not gratitude exactly. Something narrower and older than that. Recognition between enemies who had both just seen the same structure from inside. Nadia gave no answering gesture. She could not. She did not forgive him. She did not forgive the Rhyssar. That was not what this was. What this was would cost her. She learned how quickly in the first hour after adjournment. Public feeds split hard. Some called Earth the only species in the room willing to defend law against expedient cruelty. Others called Earth reckless, disloyal to its own dead, seduced by technical theory while corridor civilians remained in danger. Cinder Reach survivor networks were already fracturing. Some praised Nadia for refusing to let another generation be sentenced by the same language that had once written off frontier losses as acceptable collateral. Others accused her of giving the Rhyssar political shelter their victims never received. Jonas found her in the outer mission hall, reading the first wave summaries, and took the screen away. "You do not need every wound immediately," he said. "They're going to matter. Yes. Later. Not all in the first 10 minutes. He handed her a cup of awful chamber coffee from the diplomatic service card. Nadia drank it anyway because her body had gone past preference. Across the hall, Nemi Quill was speaking with archive enforcement teams. She looked like someone who had decided her career had already ended and therefore felt oddly free. When she finished, she crossed to Nadia. "They are sealing the directorate's historical branch. They will try to redact half of it before sunset. They will try." Nadia studied her. "Why help us?" Nemi glanced toward the chamber doors, where minor delegations were still spilling into corridor clusters, half arguing and half gossiping. "Because archives are supposed to preserve sequence. And lately I've spent too many years watching institutions turn sequence into costume." That answer was so purely Nemi that Nadia almost smiled. Before she could speak again, another voice came from the side corridor. "Delegate Thorn." "Sir." He approached without ceremony this time. The chamber polish was gone from him. He looked tired in the honest way men of power rarely allowed themselves to look in public. "You have made several sectors less stable today," he said, and made one sentence harder to clean. He stopped at a formal distance, not close enough for intimacy and not far enough for indifference. "There are worlds in Halion that will curse Earth for this. I know. You may discover that moral victories do not calm frightened freight lanes. I did not come here for a moral victory." "No," Sarah said. "You came for a line." She said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. "For what is worth, I still think you chose the more dangerous path." Nadia met his gaze. That is how I know it was probably the real one. Something like unwilling respect crossed his face and was gone. Later that evening, security officers entered the directorate wing. Not an arrest. Not yet. Large systems never moved that fast against their own unless they smelled total collapse. But Kalis Warren was formally removed from supervisory authority pending review, and for a few brief hours the public fact of that mattered almost as much as any eventual judgment. Nadia did not see him taken from the wing. She saw him once more on the upper transit bridge outside the legal annex. He was walking without escort at that moment, heading toward a restricted corridor, his coat still perfectly straight. He stopped when he saw her. Neither spoke first. At last Warren said, "You think this changes what frightened systems will do?" "No," Nadia said. "I think it changes how easily they will pretend not to know what they are doing." His expression hardened. There are consequences when governance loses nerve. There are consequences when governance loses its soul. Warrant's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but empty of warmth. Soul is a luxury concept. Order is not. That is exactly why people like you are dangerous. He looked at her in the long, cool way officials used when deciding whether history would one day flatten you into an irritant or a threat. Then he stepped past her and disappeared in the corridor. Nadia stood there a moment longer than necessary. He believed what he had done. That was the worst part. Not greed. Not cruelty for pleasure. Conviction. He had convinced himself that damaged people, managed efficiently enough, could still serve stability. Men like that always believed the galaxy would thank them later. It was nearly full dark over Selvaris Prime when Nadia finally returned to the memorial gallery. This time the corridors were empty. She stopped again before the Cinderreach wall. Finn's name waited where it had waited all these years, unchanged by what had happened in the chamber. Her brother was still dead. The Rhyssar still had blood on them. The corridor worlds still had reason to be afraid. The Council still remained a machine built by species who all preferred danger when it was pointed away from themselves. Nothing about the vote repaired any of that. Yet something had changed. If the chamber had passed permanent isolation that day, the record would have hardened around a lie elegant enough to live for decades. Future officials would cite it. Future crises would borrow it. Future frightened blocks would say there was precedent for species-level removal when instability crossed a useful threshold. And one day humanity, difficult and fast and unwilling to fold, would hear the same logic turn toward Earth or one of its colonies. Nadia touched Finn's name again. I still hate what they did, she said quietly. That was the truth. Then another truth. But I hate what the chamber wanted to do with it more. No revelation followed. No peace. That belonged to stories built for comfort, not to life inside systems this large. What came instead was something colder and steadier. Earth had not kept its dignity by crushing an enemy. Earth had kept it by refusing to let grief be borrowed as legal fuel for somebody else's machine. When she left the memorial wing, Jonas was waiting outside with a packet of late briefs and the exhausted posture of a man who had spent an entire day pretending disaster could still be scheduled politely. Ambassador Marr wants you in the strategy room in 20 minutes, he said. Corridor blocks are already drafting new transit demands. The review commission names will become a war by morning. Also, half the feed panels are calling you dangerous and the other half are calling you necessary. Only half. Some are still deciding. They began walking toward the mission corridor. After a few steps, Jonas said, for what it is worth, Finn would probably have hated everything about today. Nadia let out one tired breath that was not quite a laugh. Yes, he also might have hated the chamber more than he hated you. That one found somewhere unguarded. Maybe, she said. They reached the curve where the Hall of Concord disappeared behind diplomatic walls. For a moment, Nadia stopped and looked back at the immense outer shell of the building, its bronze glass catching the city lights below. From a distance, it still looked like what it had always wanted to look like. Order, wisdom, civilized scale. Up close, she knew better now. It was a place where entire peoples could be sorted into categories neat enough to comfort those who were not being sorted. And yet, for one day at least, it had been forced to hesitate. Not because the galaxy had become kind. Not because the Rhyssar had become harmless. Not because Earth had forgotten its dead. It had hesitated because one line, spoken clearly enough and carried by a species the chamber expected to obey the script, had made it impossible to pretend that injury and judgment were unrelated. Tomorrow the Council would start healing itself. It would narrow language, compartmentalize blame, promise review, delay exposure, turn shock into procedure, and turn procedure into survival. Nadia knew that. So did Marr. So did Nemi. So did Ser, probably better than any of them. But survival was not victory, and institutions bled truth differently when forced to do it in public. By the time they reached the mission wing, the next fight was already waiting. The chamber. Battle was over. The political aftermath was not. A fresh summary flashed across Jonas's tablet. Emergency market reaction in Helion mixed. Transit unions unsettled. Independent blocs calling for broader audit of species-level security practices. Earth public channels divided. Military corridors quiet for now. For now. Nadia almost smiled at that. It was the most honest phrase in politics. Inside the strategy room, Ambassador Mars stood over a projected map of the corridor and looked up when Nadia entered. "You have become inconvenient at scale," Mars said. "I assumed that was clear earlier. It is now measurable." Jonas set the briefs down. Nemi was already in the room, cross-cleared under temporary investigative authority, which told Nadia just how serious the next phase would be. 3 other Earth staffers were present, all carrying the same look of people who had crossed from management into consequence. Mar gestured to the map. Helion remains fragile. The substitute motion bought time, not peace. Several corridor worlds want harsher transit controls immediately. Others want full exposure of directorate methods before any further Rhyssar restriction. The review commission naming fight begins within the hour. Warren has allies. Sir has not stopped moving. And Earth is now publicly associated with the principle that species damage cannot be converted into lawful erasure. That principle will attract every difficult case in the next 10 years. Nadia set her cup down. "Then we defend it carefully." Mars studied her a moment. "Do you regret it?" The room went still. Nadia thought of Finn, of Tarov under the witness light, of Soren in his failing ward, of Warren, convinced that order was worth any quiet violence if the paperwork survived, of Sayre, who understood danger and still preferred manageable lies to destabilizing truth, of the chamber, huge and polished and willing to erase people if the argument sounded disciplined enough. "No," she said. She let the rest come in one plain line. "I regret that the choice existed." No one answered immediately because there was nothing easy to say after that. Mar nodded once and turned back to the map. The meeting went late. There were names to fight over, corridor guarantees to shape, public lines to draft, and smaller Earth feeds to calm before anger hardened into myth. Nadia worked through it all because history never paused simply because a chamber had spent one afternoon telling the truth by accident. Near the end, when the first local dawn band was beginning to gray the outer windows again, Nemi passed her a small sealed strip. "What is it?" Nadia asked. "Additional archive reference," Nemi said. "Very early adaptive governance studies. Humanity is not the only other species in them." Nadia looked at the strip, then at Nemi. "So this gets worse." Nemi's expression held no surprise. "It gets larger." That was the final shape of it, Nadia realized. Larger. Not only the Rhyssar, not only Earth, not only one security office and one vote and one dead brother and one chamber sentence. Larger. A galaxy that had spent too long mistaking management for justice. A council that preferred frightened order to difficult honesty. A habit of treating whole peoples as systems first and living minds second. Nadia closed her hand around the strip. Then she looked out through the high strategy room glass at Selvaris Prime, turning once more beneath the Hall of Concord. The city below was waking. Shuttles were lifting. Dock crews were cycling in. Markets were opening. Somewhere parents were feeding children who would never hear the full argument that had just altered the legal weather above them. Somewhere in the Rhyssar belts, frightened people were still trapped inside damaged civic networks. Somewhere along the Helion corridor, other frightened people were still checking locks and freight routes and wondering whether the council had just made their future safer or more fragile. Nadia could not give any of them certainty. She could only give them this. For one critical day, when the easiest path was to let the galaxy use Earth's pain as the final seal on a species sentence, humanity had refused. Not because humanity was pure. Not because humanity was forgiving. Not because humanity lacked anger. But because humanity had looked at a larger system preparing to turn injury into permanent law and said no, not in our name. That refusal would not end fear. It would not raise the dead. It would not make enemies into friends. What it could do, if Earth defended it well enough from here, was leave a scar in the official record that future hands would have to feel. A scar saying that even in a chamber large enough to forget individual names, even in a galaxy that liked its cruelty procedural and its conscience outsourced, there had been one moment when the script failed, and Earth had been the reason. As the lights of the council dimmed and the voices of the chamber faded, one truth remained. Humanity was never measured by how easily it could destroy an enemy. It was measured by what it refused to become, even when pain, fear, and power demanded the easier choice. And maybe that is why the galaxy will never fully understand us. Because when every system around us is ready to trade conscience for control, humanity still finds a way to stand, to endure, and to say no. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you what makes humanity different, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful science fiction, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for being here. And until the next story, keep looking to the stars.